Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down. Hanging out today with Fred Kaplan. He's got his brand new book, The Bomb. This has been your life's work for a long time, my friend. How are you?
Okay, thanks for having me on.
So you've obviously studied this, written about it. What was it like putting this version of the book together and kind of deep diving into several presidencies and their nuclear strategies?
Well, my very first book in 1983, which was called The Wizards of Armageddon, was about the small group of intellectuals who invented the concepts of nuclear war fighting, nuclear deterrence, that sort of thing. I got a lot of documents declassified back then. I interviewed about 160 people. But at the time, there was very little information out there about what the presidents themselves actually thought, said about nuclear weapons, nuclear war. Since then, as I discovered when doing the research for this book, there's a mountain load of documents on that sort of thing as well. And in the case of Presidents Kennedy and Nixon and Johnson, tapes also. So this book is more about the actual decision makers, the actual decisions. What happened when different presidents were faced with crises in which they considered the use of nuclear weapons, and what kinds of thinking did they go through, what kinds of decisions did they make, what kinds of pressures they were under. So it's a different sort of book, and it's you know, the subtitle is The Secret, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. A lot of this material has really never been out there before.
Yeah, I think the personal decision-making is pretty fascinating because you go all the way back to Kennedy and kind of being freaked out by everything that's going on. And Eisenhower,
Truman
too.
as well.
Yeah, and then all the way up to Trump and his very outlandish speaking about nuclear warfare. So what fascinated you the most just about, you know, any particular president in general, just about his relationship with nuclear warfare?
Well, to me, still the most fascinating and smartest president of them all was John Kennedy. He came into office believing there was a missile gap. The Russians were way ahead of us in missiles. This was in 1961. He was a hawk. He told the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top generals and admirals, in their first meeting that he was going to consult with them a lot, that he was going to take very seriously what they said. And in the course of his all too brief presidency, he turned around a lot. Very early on, it was discovered through satellite photos that there was no missile gap. He had a few crises over Laos, Berlin, and most famously the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which he realized, A, that his advisors, military and civilian, were not as smart as he thought they were. B, that any step that we took toward war with the Soviet Union was almost certain to escalate to nuclear war. And then he, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis, tried to take steps to end the Cold War. And Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, joined him in some of the steps. And then within a few months, Kennedy was assassinated. A year later, Khrushchev was ousted. And it was really only starting then in 1964 that the nuclear arms race really started going off on a tear.
Yeah, I mean, this rivalry has been going on for decades. When you think back to the Soviet Union, even to present-day Russia.
Sure.
What is it that we as a country have had such trouble with when it's come to Russia and that relationship?
Well, you know, during the beginning of the Cold War, you know, going back to even the 40s, but especially in the 50s, and as we developed nuclear weapons, the fear was that the Soviet Union would invade Western Europe or occupy the west part of Berlin. We didn't have much of a conventional army back then in Europe to deal with that. So the idea was, if you do this, we will destroy you with nuclear weapons. And by the way, destroy is not an overstatement. The nuclear war plan, the plan, say in 1960, approved by the president and the Joint Chiefs and everybody, was that if the Soviet Union or China invaded even a small part of the territory that was in our vital interest, we would unleash the entire nuclear arsenal against every target in the Soviet Union, China, even if China wasn't even part of the war, and the Eastern European nations, the satellite nations of the Warsaw Pact. Somebody asked how many people would get killed in this attack. It was 285 million people. Wow. I mean, it's beyond even, you can barely fathom this. It's beyond comprehension. And the notion that any war aim would be worth killing that many people. But see, then what happened In the early 60s, the Soviets started to build their own nuclear arsenal. So this became a problem. Let's say they invade Western Europe. We strike them with all of our nuclear weapons. They could strike us with their nuclear weapons. So it's a suicide. It's a policy of suicide. And that's when presidents, generals, strategists started to come up with ideas. Well, let's see if we can figure out a way, what they called limited nuclear options. You know, maybe we could just fire a few nuclear weapons just at their military targets. And that would send them a signal that if they respond, they should restrict their response just to our military targets. We'll try to wind this thing down before everybody gets blown up. And in other words, the people who first talked about limited nuclear war were, in a way, trying to look for a more dovish way out of this thing. But nobody, through all the decades, could really figure this out, how to really do it. Would the Russians go along? Nobody knew. Could they go along if they wanted to? Probably not, especially back then. And the impulse toward escalation is something that everybody realizes is almost inevitable.
Yeah, I think that's the craziest part about it, is that everyone's still kind of trying to figure it out. So when you think about it, like, you've lived through some of this, you've studied it, like, who should we have feared the most when it comes to their relationship with nuclear weapons? Because it's one thing for Trump to talk about it, but it's another thing for the Cold War to be going on. Like, which president was really the most pro-nuclear weapon when you think about it?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I mean, initially Reagan. Reagan, whom I covered as a reporter, turns out to be a very fascinating character. During his first term, very anti-communist, you know, as he had been all of his life, boosted the nuclear weapons budget a lot, made extraordinary comments threatening Russia, and there were some activities going on too. Planes crossing into Soviet borders, boats going up into Soviet harbors. Very provocative. Then he realized in his second term that the Russians were taking this very seriously, really thought we were about to launch a first strike, which he wasn't.